Imagine you're living in ancient Rome, right at the edge of disaster. Your army has been crushed. Your fields are nothing but ashes. And every night you wonder if tomorrow will be worse. The enemy, led by the legendary Hannibal, seems unstoppable. No one knows how to defeat him. Rome is desperate, and hope is fading. But sometimes, when everything feels lost, the solution doesn't come from someone charging in with a sword. Sometimes it comes from patience, from someone who dares to think differently, who is brave enough to break the rules everyone else follows. That person turns out to be Fabius Maximus. Now, Fabius wasn't a superstar general like the ones in the old heroic legends. He was older, cautious, and honestly a bit stubborn. People didn't cheer when he walked into the forum. In fact, they often criticized him, calling him slow and even cowardly. But here's the twist. Fabius understood something that almost no one else did. He knew that fighting Hannibal in open battle would only bring more disaster. So he chose a different path, one that required nerves of steel and the patience of a farmer waiting for his crops to grow. Here's a fun fact. Fabius got the nickname Cunctator, which means the delayer, because he refused to rush into battle. People even made jokes about him as if he were just wasting time. But while the crowds were losing their patience, Fabius was quietly working to save Rome in his own way. He understood that war isn't always about who has the biggest army or the sharpest swords. Sometimes it's about outthinking your enemy, making them chase shadows and wearing them down until they're too tired to keep fighting. That's exactly what he did. Instead of meeting Hannibal head-on, he attacked the Carthaginian supply lines, cut off their food, and forced them to wander through unfamiliar lands where even the weather could turn against them. This wasn't the glorious, heroic story people loved to hear, but it was exactly what Rome needed. Fabius proved that endurance and a clever mind can achieve what brute force cannot. And as we'll see, his quiet courage and refusal to give up helped turn the tide when Rome was at its lowest point. So, before we dive deeper into this ancient tale, take a moment to imagine yourself in those days, wondering if your city would survive. The story of Fabius Maximus is not just about battles, but about one man's ability to stand firm against fear, even when everyone else doubted him. And in the end, his patience changed history. Oh, and did you know? Fabius's tactics were so clever that, centuries later, famous leaders like George Washington would study and use his methods in their own wars. His legacy truly reached far beyond the fields of ancient Italy. Let's dive in and discover how endurance, courage, and a little bit of stubbornness can change the fate of a nation. Picture this. It's 218 years before Christ, and Rome is about to face its worst nightmare. For centuries, the Roman Republic has been growing stronger, conquering neighbors, building roads, and spreading its influence across the Mediterranean. But now, something unprecedented is happening. A brilliant young general from Carthage named Hannibal is doing the impossible. He's bringing war directly to Rome's doorstep. The Alps, those towering mountains that everyone thought were an impenetrable barrier, have just been crossed by an entire army. Hannibal didn't just walk across them. He brought elephants, cavalry, and thousands of seasoned warriors through paths that Romans believed no army could navigate. It was like someone finding a secret passage into your fortress that you never knew existed. The first sign of trouble came at a place called Trebia. Roman legions, proud and confident, marched out to meet this foreign threat. They expected to crush these invaders quickly, the way they'd crushed so many enemies before. Instead, they walked straight into a trap. Hannibal's forces didn't just win, they destroyed an entire Roman army. Survivors stumbled back to Rome with tales of tactical brilliance that seemed almost supernatural, but that was just the beginning. The real shock came at Lake Trasimene, where Hannibal pulled off one of the most devastating ambushes in military history. He hid his entire army in the morning mist around the lake, and when the Romans marched through thinking they were pursuing a retreating enemy, they found themselves surrounded on all sides. In just 3 hours, 15,000 Romans died. The consul Flaminius himself was killed in the fighting. Imagine being a Roman citizen hearing this news. Your invincible legions, the pride of the Republic, had been wiped out not once, but twice. The road to Rome was now wide open, and there seemed to be nothing standing between Hannibal and your city. Panic gripped the capital. People rushed to the temples, begging the gods for protection. Some packed their belongings, preparing to flee. The Senate, that august body of Rome's finest minds, was in complete chaos. They'd tried the conventional approach, meet force with force, Roman courage against Carthaginian cunning, and it had failed spectacularly. This is when they made one of the most important decisions in Roman history. Instead of choosing another young, aggressive general to lead a counterattack, they turned to someone completely different, Quintus Fabius Maximus. He was already in his late 50s, an age when most Romans were thinking about retirement, not warfare. He'd fought in wars before, but he was known more for his careful, methodical approach than for brilliant victories. To many Romans, this choice seemed almost insulting. Here was their greatest crisis, and they were putting an old man in charge, someone who'd never shown the kind of daring that Romans admired. But the Senate was desperate, and sometimes desperation leads to wisdom. Fabius accepted the role of dictator, a temporary position that gave him absolute power during emergencies. But from the moment he took command, it was clear he was going to do things differently. While Romans everywhere were crying for revenge, demanding that their legions march out and crush Hannibal in a glorious battle, Fabius said something that shocked everyone. No. He studied the situation with the cold eye of experience. Yes, Hannibal was a brilliant general. Yes, his army was formidable, but Fabius saw something that others missed. Weaknesses that could be exploited, but only with patience. Hannibal was far from home, in enemy territory, dependent on local supplies and allies. Every day he stayed in Italy, he was like a shark that had to keep moving to survive. The Romans had advantages too. They knew their own land intimately. They had more soldiers, more resources, and time was on their side. But to use these advantages, they had to do something that went against every instinct in the Roman character. They had to wait. This is where Fabius showed his true genius. He understood that this wasn't just a military problem, it was a psychological one. Hannibal wasn't just trying to defeat Roman armies, he was trying to break Roman spirit. Every spectacular victory made Rome's allies wonder if they were backing the wrong side. Every dramatic defeat made Romans question whether their republic could survive. So Fabius decided to flip the script. Instead of giving Hannibal the climactic battles he wanted, battles where his superior tactics could shine, Fabius would give him something much more frustrating, a ghost war. Roman armies would shadow Hannibal's every move but never engage directly. They'd attack his supply lines, pick off stragglers, and disappear into the hills when he tried to retaliate. The strategy was brilliant in its simplicity, but it required something that Romans found almost impossible to accept: humility. For generations, Roman culture had celebrated courage, honor, and glorious victory. Now their leader was telling them that their path to survival lay in avoiding the very battles that defined their identity. The reaction was immediate and brutal. Romans began calling Fabius cunctator, the delayer. It wasn't meant as a compliment. In Roman society, hesitation was almost as shameful as cowardice. Warriors were supposed to face their enemies head-on, not skulk in the shadows like bandits. But Fabius had made his choice. He knew that to save Rome, he would have to break its pride. And in the hills of Italy, as his legions learned to fight a new kind of war, the fate of the Republic hung in the balance. The question wasn't whether Romans could defeat Hannibal in battle. They'd already proven they couldn't. The question was whether they could swallow their pride long enough to let an old man's patient strategy work its magic. The shadow of defeat hung over Rome, but in that darkness, Fabius Maximus was quietly preparing to turn the tide of history. Now comes the truly fascinating part. While all of Rome is screaming for blood, demanding that their armies march out and crush Hannibal in one glorious battle, Fabius does something that seems almost magical. He makes his legions disappear. Picture Hannibal waking up one morning to find Roman campfires burning on the hills around him. His scouts report enemy movements in the distance, But when he marches his army toward these Romans, ready for the decisive battle that will end this war, he finds nothing. The Romans have melted away like morning mist, leaving behind only cold ashes and the echo of their departure. This wasn't accidental. Fabius had completely reimagined what Roman warfare could be. For generations, Roman generals had won fame by leading massive armies into crushing frontal assaults. The more dramatic the victory, the greater the glory. But Fabius looked at Hannibal's track record and realized something crucial. This Carthaginian genius thrived on exactly those kinds of battles. Every time the Romans gave him what he wanted, he turned it into a masterpiece of tactical destruction. So Fabius decided to give Hannibal something he'd never faced before: an enemy who refused to play by the rules. The strategy was brilliantly simple. Roman legions would track Hannibal's army like wolves following a herd, always close enough to strike, but never close enough to be caught. They'd wait for the perfect moment, when Carthaginian soldiers were spread out foraging for food, or when a small group had separated from the main force, and then they'd attack with lightning speed before vanishing back into the countryside. Imagine how frustrating this must have been for Hannibal. Here was a general who'd spent his entire career perfecting the art of battlefield tactics, who could read an enemy's formation like a book and predict exactly how they'd move. But now he was facing an enemy who simply wouldn't give him a battlefield to work with. The Romans became masters of what we might call guerrilla warfare today. They'd strike at Hannibal's supply lines, cutting off the food and equipment his army desperately needed. They'd attack his messengers, disrupting his communications with allies. They'd harass his foraging parties, making it dangerous for Carthaginian soldiers to wander far from the main camp. But here's what made Fabius truly exceptional. He understood that this wasn't just about military tactics. It was about psychology. Every day that Hannibal stayed in Italy without achieving a decisive victory, his position grew weaker. His soldiers, who'd followed him across the Alps expecting quick triumph and rich rewards, began to wonder if they'd ever see their homes again. Meanwhile, Rome's Italian allies, who might have been tempted to switch sides after Hannibal's early victories, started to have second thoughts. If the great Hannibal couldn't even bring the Romans to battle, maybe he wasn't as invincible as they'd believed. The genius of Fabius lay in seeing what others missed. While Romans saw only Hannibal's brilliant victories, Fabius saw the fundamental weakness in the Carthaginian position. Hannibal was like a skilled fisherman who'd caught a huge fish but now couldn't reel it in. The longer the fight went on, the more exhausted he'd become. Hannibal's army was living off the land, which meant they were constantly moving, constantly searching for food and supplies. Roman armies, on the other hand, could be resupplied from their own cities and fortified positions. In a war of attrition, time was on Rome's side, if they had the patience to use it. But patience was exactly what Romans found hardest to accept. Back in the capital, the political pressure on Fabius was becoming unbearable. Senators who'd never seen a battlefield were calling him a coward. Citizens were rioting in the streets demanding action. Even his own officers began to question whether their commander had lost his nerve. The most dramatic challenge came from his own deputy, Marcus Minucius, who held the position of Master of Horse. This was essentially Fabius's second-in-command, and he was everything that Fabius wasn't: young, aggressive, and hungry for glory. Minucius became convinced that Fabius was wasting golden opportunities to destroy Hannibal once and for all. The tension between these two men tells us everything about the struggle happening within Roman society. Minucius represented the old Roman way: bold, direct, honorable. He believed that real warriors settled their differences on the battlefield, not through what he saw as cowardly hit-and-run tactics. One day, Minucius finally had enough. While Fabius was away in Rome dealing with political pressure, his deputy decided to take matters into his own hands. He spotted what looked like a perfect opportunity. A portion of Hannibal's army seemed vulnerable, separated from the main force. Against all orders, Minucius launched an attack. At first, it seemed like the young commander's boldness would be vindicated. His forces struck hard and fast, and for a moment it looked like they might achieve the kind of glorious victory that Romans had been dreaming of. But then the trap closed. What Minucius had seen as an opportunity was actually bait, and Hannibal had been waiting for exactly this kind of reckless charge. The Roman forces found themselves surrounded, cut off from retreat, facing the same kind of tactical masterpiece that had destroyed so many of their comrades. Minucius, the man who'd criticized Fabius for being too cautious, suddenly found himself and his entire command about to be wiped out. That's when something remarkable happened. Fabius, who could have let his disobedient deputy face the consequences of his actions, instead rushed to the rescue. The old general led his own forces in a perfectly timed counterattack that saved Minucius and his men from certain destruction. The aftermath of this incident was perhaps even more telling than the rescue itself. Minucius, humbled and grateful, publicly acknowledged his mistake and pledged to follow Fabius's strategy. But more importantly, the Roman soldiers who witnessed this event began to understand something profound about their commander. Fabius wasn't avoiding battle because he was afraid. He was avoiding battle because he understood something that everyone else had missed. While other generals saw Hannibal as an invincible force of nature, Fabius saw him as a brilliant but ultimately human opponent trapped in an impossible situation. This insight reveals the true artistry of Fabian tactics. It wasn't just about avoiding direct confrontation. It was about understanding your enemy so completely that you could turn their strengths into weaknesses. Hannibal's tactical genius became irrelevant when there were no major battles to fight. His inspiring leadership became a burden when his soldiers grew tired of endless marching without decisive victories. In the hills and valleys of Italy, Fabius was playing a completely different game than anyone had played before. While Hannibal was trying to win the war through brilliant tactics, Fabius was trying to win it through patience, endurance, and an almost supernatural understanding of human nature. The question wasn't whether Romans could outfight Hannibal's army. They'd already proven they couldn't. The question was whether they could outlast him, and whether Fabius could hold his own people together long enough for his strategy to work its slow magic. What would you have done? Face Hannibal in battle or wear him down? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and share this video to spread the legacy of Rome's greatest strategist. Subscribe to Legacy of Empires for more tales of history's unsung heroes. Here's where the story takes a heartbreaking turn, because sometimes being right isn't enough. Sometimes wisdom loses to passion, and patience crumbles under the weight of politics. You have to understand something about Roman culture to grasp what happened next. Romans didn't just want to win, they wanted to win gloriously. Their entire identity was built around the idea of courageous warriors facing their enemies in open battle. When fathers told stories to their sons, they didn't talk about clever strategies or patient endurance. They talked about heroic charges, dramatic victories, and the honor that came from looking death in the eye and not blinking. Fabius's approach, brilliant as it was, violated everything Romans believed about themselves. Every day that passed, without a decisive battle, felt like a betrayal of their ancestor. Every small victory through hit-and-run tactics felt hollow compared to the crushing defeats their enemies had inflicted on them. The Roman people weren't just frustrated, they were ashamed. This shame became a weapon in the hands of Fabius's political enemies. Leading this opposition was a man named Gaius Terentius Varro, everything that Fabius wasn't. Where Fabius was cautious, Varro was bold. Where Fabius was patient, Varro was eager for action. Where Fabius spoke of strategy, Varro spoke of honor. Varro was a master politician, and he understood exactly how to tap into Roman frustration. He painted Fabius as a coward who was prolonging the war unnecessarily. He argued that Rome's legions were the finest fighting force in the world, and that with proper leadership, they could crush Hannibal in a single decisive battle. The message was intoxicating. After months of feeling helpless, of watching their armies shadow Hannibal like timid wolves, Romans were ready to believe that their problems could be solved with one bold stroke. Varro promised them exactly what they wanted to hear, that Roman courage and Roman steel were all they needed to end this nightmare. The political pressure became overwhelming. The Senate, which had reluctantly supported Fabius's unconventional strategy, began to waver. Citizens demanded action. Even many of Fabius's own supporters started to question whether his approach was really working. Yes, they'd prevented Hannibal from winning any major victories, but they hadn't driven him from Italy either. In 216 years before Christ, Roman politics finally triumphed over Roman strategy. The Republic elected 2 new consuls to lead their armies, and one of them was Varro himself. The other was Lucius Aemilius Paulus, a more cautious man who understood the wisdom of Fabius's approach, but who found himself swept along by the tide of public opinion. The stage was set for the confrontation that everyone had been demanding. Rome would finally give Hannibal the massive battle he'd been waiting for. They would meet him with the largest army in Roman history, 8 full legions plus auxiliary troops, nearly 90,000 men in total. It would be a force so overwhelming that no tactical genius, no matter how brilliant, could possibly overcome it. The location was a small town in southern Italy called Cannae. The name would become synonymous with disaster. What happened there on that summer day was exactly what Fabius had been trying to prevent. Hannibal, given the large-scale battle he'd been hoping for, proceeded to demonstrate why he was considered one of the greatest military minds in history. He deployed his forces in a formation that seemed almost suicidal, a weak center that invited Roman attack, with strong wings that could wrap around and encircle the enemy. The Roman army, led by the aggressive Varro, did exactly what Hannibal expected. They smashed into the Carthaginian center with overwhelming force, driving the enemy back. For a moment, it seemed like the bold approach would be vindicated. The Romans were winning, pushing deeper into enemy lines on the verge of the decisive victory they'd been promised. But then the trap closed. The weak center had been deliberate bait, and as the Romans pressed forward, Hannibal's wings swept around them like the jaws of a massive predator. The Roman army found itself completely surrounded, packed so tightly together that they couldn't even swing their weapons effectively. What followed was not a battle, but a massacre. Packed into an ever-shrinking space, with nowhere to run and no room to maneuver, the Roman legions were systematically destroyed. Consul Paulus, the cautious one who'd tried to urge restraint, died fighting heroically in the thick of the carnage. Varro, the man who'd promised easy victory, fled the field. The numbers are almost impossible to comprehend. In a single day, Rome lost nearly 50,000 men. To put this in perspective, that was roughly 1 out of every 8 adult male citizens in the entire Republic. Entire families were wiped out. Whole neighborhoods in Rome would never see their sons, fathers, and brothers again. The aftermath was even more devastating than the battle itself. News of the disaster spread throughout Italy like wildfire. Rome's allies, who had remained loyal through years of uncertainty, began to question whether they were backing the right side. Some cities that had been Roman for generations suddenly opened their gates to Hannibal. The carefully constructed web of alliances that had made Rome dominant in Italy began to unravel. In the capital itself, panic reached levels that made the earlier defeats seem minor. There was talk of abandoning the city entirely, of fleeing to some distant corner of the empire where they might be safe from Hannibal's vengeance. The Senate, which had governed with confidence for centuries, seemed paralyzed by the magnitude of the catastrophe. And in this moment of absolute despair, something remarkable happened. People began to remember an old man who'd been mocked as a coward. They recalled his warnings about the dangers of direct confrontation with Hannibal. They remembered how he'd kept Roman armies intact while everyone else was demanding the kind of glorious battle that had just destroyed the Republic. The irony was bitter and complete. Fabius had spent months being called a coward for refusing to fight Hannibal directly. Now, in the aftermath of Cannae, everyone could see that his cowardice had been wisdom and that the courage they demanded had been foolishness. But this recognition came too late to prevent the disaster. The Roman Republic was closer to collapse than it had ever been in its history. The strategy that might have saved them had been abandoned for the sake of political popularity and wounded pride. And somewhere in the ruins of that terrible day, you could almost hear the ghost of Fabius whispering the truth that no one had wanted to hear, that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse to fight. The price of impatience had been paid in blood, and now Rome would have to learn all over again the lessons that Fabius had tried to teach them. The question was whether they would have the chance to apply those lessons, or whether Cannae had sealed their fate forever. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from dramatic moments of triumph, but from the quiet persistence of doing what's right when no one is watching. This is the story of how an old man's patience finally saved an empire. After Cannae, Rome was a broken city. The streets that had once echoed with the confident voices of citizens planning conquests now whispered with the prayers of widows and the tears of orphans. The Senate, which had governed with such certainty for centuries, met in emergency sessions where grown men wept openly for their lost sons and brothers. But even in this darkest hour, there was one voice that didn't despair. Fabius Maximus, the man they had mocked as a coward, stepped forward once again. He was older now, his hair whiter, his step perhaps a little slower, but his eyes held the same steady resolve that had frustrated Hannibal for so long. The Rome that called him back was very different from the one that had dismissed him. The arrogant confidence was gone, replaced by a desperate humility. The citizens who had once demanded glorious battles now begged simply for survival. And this time, when Fabius spoke of patience and endurance, people listened. But here's what made Fabius truly remarkable. He didn't say, "I told you so." He didn't waste time on recriminations or political revenge. Instead, he quietly rolled up his sleeves and got to work on the unglamorous task of rebuilding a shattered republic. The work was heartbreaking in its mundane difficulty. There would be no dramatic victories to celebrate, no glorious charges to sing about. Instead, Fabius focused on the 1,000 small tasks that nobody else wanted to do. He organized the defense of individual cities. He secured supply lines that had been cut. He negotiated with wavering allies who were considering switching sides. Most importantly, he kept Hannibal from delivering the final blow that would have ended the war. The Carthaginian general, emboldened by his victory at Cannae, had expected Rome to collapse entirely. Many of his advisors urged him to march directly on the capital while the Republic was still reeling. But everywhere Hannibal turned, he found the same ghostly opposition that had frustrated him before Cannae. Fabius had learned something crucial from the disaster. His strategy had been right, but his execution had been incomplete. He'd focused so much on avoiding major battles that he'd neglected the positive aspects of warfare. Now, older and wiser, he began to combine his defensive genius with carefully planned offensive operations. The new approach was methodical and relentless. Instead of trying to destroy Hannibal's army in one climactic battle, Fabius began systematically reclaiming Italy piece by piece. He would isolate a city that had defected to Carthage, surround it with Roman forces, and patiently wait for it to surrender. When Hannibal rushed to relieve the siege, Fabius would slip away, leaving the Carthaginian to chase shadows, while Roman engineers prepared the next operation. One by one, the cities that had abandoned Rome after Cannae began to return to the fold. It wasn't dramatic, and it certainly wasn't quick, but it was incredibly effective. Hannibal found himself fighting a war of attrition where every small victory cost him resources he couldn't replace, while every Roman setback could be overcome with fresh troops and supplies from the unconquered heartland. The genius of this approach was that it played to Rome's fundamental strengths. The Republic might not have been able to match Hannibal's tactical brilliance, but it had something the Carthaginian couldn't compete with: institutional resilience. Roman culture was built around the idea of collective sacrifice for the greater good. When one generation fell, another would rise to take its place, and that's exactly what happened. As Fabius continued his patient work of reconstruction, a new generation of Roman leaders began to emerge. These were men who had grown up during the war, who had seen firsthand the consequences of both reckless aggression and patient strategy. They understood Fabius's lessons in a way that the pre-war generation never could. The most promising of these young leaders was Publius Cornelius Scipio, a man who combined the best of both Roman traditions. He had the bold courage that Romans admired, but he also had the strategic patience that Fabius had taught them to value. Most importantly, he understood that the war couldn't be won by simply outlasting Hannibal in Italy. It had to be won by taking the fight to Carthage itself. The relationship between Fabius and Scipio tells us everything about how wisdom passes from one generation to the next. The old master recognized the young man's potential but worried about his eagerness for grand gestures. Scipio, for his part, respected Fabius's achievements, but chafed at what he saw as excessive caution. Their debates in the Senate became legendary. Fabius would argue for continuing the proven strategy of patient pressure, while Scipio would advocate for bold action that could end the war quickly. But these weren't bitter arguments. They were the productive tensions between experience and innovation, between the wisdom of age and the energy of youth. What made their relationship so special was that both men understood they were working toward the same goal. Fabius wasn't trying to hold Scipio back out of jealousy or stubbornness. He was trying to ensure that the lessons learned through so much suffering wouldn't be forgotten in the excitement of potential victory. Finally, after years of careful preparation, Scipio got his chance. He sailed to Africa with a Roman army, carrying the war directly to Carthage's homeland. The strategy was audacious and risky, exactly the kind of bold move that the old Fabius might have opposed. But this wasn't the same man who had taken command after Cannae. This was a leader who had learned to balance patience with action, caution with courage. The climax came at a place called Zama, where Scipio's legions finally met Hannibal's forces in the decisive battle that both sides had been preparing for. But this wasn't the same kind of desperate gamble that had led to disaster at Cannae. This was a calculated risk, taken at the right time, with the right preparation, by a general who understood both the value of patience and the necessity of action. When the dust settled at Zama, Hannibal had been defeated at last. The great Carthaginian general, who had terrorized Rome for nearly 2 decades, was forced to flee his homeland. The Second Punic War was over, and Rome had survived. But here's the most remarkable part of the story. When news of Scipio's victory reached Rome, the man who celebrated most genuinely wasn't Scipio himself. It was Fabius. The old general, now in his 70s, had lived to see his strategy vindicated in the most complete way possible. Hannibal hadn't been defeated by superior tactics or brilliant generalship. He'd been defeated by patience, persistence, and the slow accumulation of small advantages. The victory at Zama was won by Scipio's courage and skill, but it was made possible by Fabius's years of unglamorous work. Every city reclaimed, every supply line secured, every day that Rome survived had contributed to the final triumph. The old man's patient strategy had created the conditions that made the young man's bold victory possible. In his final years, Fabius watched as Rome began to transform from a regional power into a Mediterranean empire. The republic that had once seemed on the verge of collapse was now conquering territories that would have been unimaginable before the war. And at the heart of this transformation was a lesson that would echo through centuries, that sometimes the greatest strength lies not in the ability to strike quickly, but in the wisdom to endure. The slow road to victory had been longer and more difficult than anyone could have imagined. But it had led Rome not just to survival, but to a greatness that would define the ancient world for centuries to come. In the year 203 before Christ, on a quiet morning in Rome, Quintus Fabius Maximus closed his eyes for the last time. He was an old man now, well into his 70s, and he had lived to see something that few people in history ever witness: the complete vindication of everything he had believed and fought for. The Rome that surrounded his deathbed was almost unrecognizable from the one he had inherited during those desperate days after Cannae. The streets that had once echoed with panic now bustled with the confident activity of a growing empire. The Senate that had once questioned his every decision now spoke of his strategy as the foundation of Roman greatness. Children who had never known the terror of Hannibal's presence played in forums that existed only because one old man had refused to give up. But here's what makes Fabius truly remarkable. He didn't die thinking about his own vindication. According to those who knew him, his final thoughts were about the lessons his life had taught, and whether future generations would remember them when they faced their own impossible challenges. The story of Fabius Maximus offers us something precious in our modern world. Proof that sometimes the most radical act is simply refusing to be rushed. In an age where we expect instant results, immediate solutions, and quick victories, Fabius reminds us that some problems can only be solved through patient persistence. Think about it. We live in a time when wars are expected to be won in days, where political crises demand instant responses, where businesses rise and fall based on quarterly results. We've created a culture that celebrates the dramatic gesture, the bold stroke, the game-changing moment. But Fabius's story suggests that this obsession with speed and spectacle might be costing us something essential. His legacy isn't just about military strategy. It's about the courage to do what you believe is right, even when everyone around you thinks you're wrong. It's about understanding that true strength often looks like weakness to those who don't understand the bigger picture. Most importantly, it's about recognizing that some victories can only be won by people who are willing to sacrifice their own glory for the greater good. The Romans eventually gave Fabius a title that captured this perfectly. They called him the Shield of Rome. Not the sword, not the spear, but the shield. He wasn't the weapon that struck the decisive blow, but the defense that made victory possible. And in a culture that worshipped aggressive warriors, choosing to be remembered as a shield was perhaps the most radical act of all. What's fascinating is how Fabius's approach has echoed throughout history. When George Washington was fighting the British during the American Revolution, he studied Fabius's campaigns and adopted similar tactics. Instead of meeting the professional British Army in the kind of formal battles they excelled at, Washington chose to wear them down through patience and persistence. The strategy that saved Rome also helped create America. During World War II, when Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany, Winston Churchill often spoke of the Fabian approach to warfare. Rather than seeking immediate decisive victories, he understood that sometimes survival itself was victory, and that time could be an ally if you knew how to use it. But perhaps the most powerful lesson from Fabius's life is about leadership itself. In our world of celebrity leaders and charismatic personalities, we often forget that some of the most effective leaders are the ones who work quietly behind the scenes, making the unglamorous decisions that keep everything functioning. Fabius never gave inspiring speeches that stirred men's hearts. He never led dramatic charges that became the stuff of legend. Instead, he did something much harder. He made the right choice, day after day, year after year, even when those choices made him unpopular. He understood that true leadership isn't about being loved, it's about being useful. There's something deeply moving about imagining Fabius in his final years, watching young Roman soldiers march off to distant conquests, knowing that their victories were built on the foundation of his patience. He could have been bitter about the lack of recognition, frustrated that others received credit for achievements that his strategy had made possible. Instead, he seems to have found peace in knowing that the work itself had been worthwhile. The ancient historians tell us that Fabius died peacefully, surrounded by family and friends who had come to understand his greatness. But his real immortality lies in the lesson he left behind, that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse to fight, and that the greatest victories are won not by those who strike first, but by those who endure longest. In our world of instant communication and constant urgency, where every problem seems to demand an immediate solution, Fabius whispers a different truth, that some challenges can only be overcome through patience, that some victories can only be won by people willing to think in terms of years rather than moments. His story reminds us that greatness isn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's as quiet as an old man choosing to do what's right instead of what's popular. As simple as refusing to give up when everyone else has lost hope. As profound as understanding that true strength often looks like weakness to those who don't know how to see. As we face our own impossible challenges, whether personal or collective, the ghost of Fabius Maximus offers us a gift, the reminder that patience is not passivity, that endurance is not surrender, and that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply refusing to be rushed into making the wrong choice. In the end, Fabius Maximus saved Rome not with brilliant tactics or inspiring leadership, but with something much rarer: the wisdom to wait, the courage to endure, and the faith that doing the right thing, even when it's unpopular, will eventually be vindicated by history. That's a legacy worth remembering, and a lesson worth learning, no matter what century we call home. If this story moved you, like the video, comment your thoughts, and share it with those who love the echoes of history. Subscribe to Legacy of Empires for more legendary tales. Until next time, Vale, farewell.